seminar, which is going to be recorded, just so you all know, and we will put it onto the Institute for African Studies website, and we're building up a lovely archive, and I encourage you all to have a look at it, because some of these discussions with authors are probably of people on your reading lists as well. And so the pandemic has helped us to build these digital archives and these resources. And students, I'm finding, are loving meeting or seeing authors in person and making, seeing this whole process of research in a more humanized way. So welcome to everybody. Special welcome all the way from the UK to Emily Bridger, who in fact is returning home in a manner of speaking, Emily, a Canadian abroad. Emily is a senior lecturer in Global and Imperial History at Exeter University in the UK, and we're going to be talking about her first book, which was a reworking of her PhD on young women in the anti-apartheid struggle. But she's also working on new work on sexual violence and the ways in which it's experienced and made meaning of, working with Kulumani, I think it is, Emily, in South Africa, which is a fantastic NGO that's done amazing work on keeping memory alive against all the efforts to pretend that the past is over. Kulumani's done fabulous work to remind us of the ongoing legacy, and Emily's now working with them on young women's, or not even young women, just women's experiences of sexual violence. This book, Young Women in the Anti-Apartheid Struggle, has a cover by the wonderful Judy Seidman, and I see that you're working with her again on that project. So I love these little circles and communities. Emily graduated from Dalhousie University and Oxford and Exeter. So welcome, Emily. And in a discussion with Emily, we have Rachel Sandwell from just down the drag, McGill University's Department of History and the Institute for Gender Studies, Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, right? And Rachel has been working in a kind of contiguous field in the same, well, as have I been working on the anti-apartheid struggles and women's place in South African political history. Rachel's work has been on the women in exile portion of this, and her book will be, hopefully we'll have it in our Knowing Africa series next year, but it's on its way. Rachel has, I can't think of a better person to comment on this, because you know the archives and the material so well. So welcome to all of you. We're going to do it as usual with Emily presenting her the main ideas of a book, Rachel commenting, and then this time, because I'm so personally invested in the debates and the questions that Emily raises in her book, I might do a much more interventionist form of chairing, and then we'll open it up to you for questions and comments. So Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm incredibly honored to be here, and as Shireen said, it's especially exciting for me to get to talk to a Canadian audience, and it is like going back home in a way. So I wanted to start my talk today with a story, and it's an abridged version of the same story which opens the book. So on a night in 1983, the South African police came knocking at the door of a family home in Diepkloof, Soweto. They were looking for Vicky, a 17-year-old girl who they had been told was involved in student anti-apartheid politics in the area. It was the middle of the night, and Vicky, her mother, sisters, and brothers were asleep. The police burst into the house, grabbed Vicky, and took her, along with 6 teenage boys they had also rounded up that night, to the local police station. When she arrived at the station, however, Vicky was initially relieved. Her father, a local policeman, was on duty. Surely he would understand and he would release her, she thought. But instead, he was furious at the sight of his daughter amongst the night's catch of young activists. "What's wrong with you?" he shouted at her. "Why don't I get your brothers here? You're a woman. How can you do this?" The next day, Vicky's gender was once again the subject of discussion. Before being officially charged, she was given the help of a lawyer. Seeing her as the only girl amongst a group of boys, he asked the police if they had perhaps made a mistake. Surely this skinny teenage girl could not have been involved in seditious politics. The police agreed, and Vicky was released. Now, the assumption made by these police officers that day, that Black girls and young women were not active agents in South Africa's liberation struggle, has since been repeated by journalists, historians, and various other commentators on South Africa's past. So many of you here will know that from about the mid-1970s right through to the early 1990s, children, students, and youth were often at the very forefront of South Africa's liberation struggle. They protested in the streets, confronted apartheid security forces with homemade rudimentary weapons, and engaged in various forms of civil disobedience and political violence. And popular depictions of such young people, who were often loosely and collectively referred to as the comrades, as brave and militant, have led to an assumption that these youth were an exclusively male group. And this is a trend that is really all too common across the study of African history and politics. Across the continent, studies of disenfranchised, politically active, or violent young people have frequently focused solely on men, with the term youth typically requiring the prefix female to even include girls and young women. Despite the evidence that female youth were involved in many of the key moments in South Africa's liberation struggle, the 1976 Soweto uprisings, the township revolts of the 1980s, and the transition conflict of the 1990s, we are very rarely given insight into their lives and perspectives. Instead, these young women tend to appear in the historiography as marginalized bystanders or as the voiceless victims of male-instigated violence. So my book, Young Women Against Apartheid, hopes to challenge this. It's based predominantly on oral history interviews conducted with about 50 former youth activists, both male and female, that I conducted between 2014 and 2016. Now middle-aged, the women that I interviewed were particularly eager to share their past experiences and repudiated any notion that they had been absent from political activism. Yes, they were far fewer in number than their male counterparts, but these women were still there. They protested in the streets, confronted security forces with stones and petrol bombs, took on leadership roles in their communities, and were detained, interrogated, and tortured by the apartheid state. So despite its fairly broad title, the book is actually quite narrowly focused. It focuses on a group of activists from Soweto, a large conglomeration of townships just outside Johannesburg. And these activists were all teenagers and school students in the 1980s and early 1990s, during a period broadly known as the township uprisings. They all joined the struggle through student or youth organizations which were aligned to the ANC, the African National Congress, such as the Congress of South African Students or the Soweto Students' Congress. Now, the book is certainly not a political history of these organizations. Rather, it's a social and cultural history that focuses on the subjectivities of these women's lives and narratives. Primarily a work of oral history, it is not only concerned with what these women did, but also with how they reconstruct their pasts, relate their personal experiences to collective histories of the struggle, and try and insert themselves into a historical narrative from which they've largely been excluded. So I'm not going to try and summarize the entire book in 20 minutes, but what I thought I'd do is give you a snapshot of just 3 of its kind of main arguments and bring in some stories to help illustrate these. And ultimately what I hope the book does is to do more than simply add female youth to existing South African historiography. Instead, I've tried to ask, how does a focus on girls and young women challenge or shift our understanding of youth politics, the liberation struggle, and South African history more broadly? So the first point I want to make today is that I think the book tells us more about the intersectional motivations for young people's activism. It first argues that we need to see these particular girls and young women as part of the broader category of youth. For many of them, their generational identities were much more salient than their gendered ones. They saw themselves as comrades, more so than as girls or women, and they wanted to participate in the struggle alongside young men rather than separately from them. I think as academics, we often incorrectly assume that when women join political struggles, they must do so out of feminist motivations or in pursuit of gendered causes. Now, when I asked interviewees why they chose to join the struggle, both men and women often gave similar responses. And these generally reflected the daily inequalities they experienced on account of their age, race, and class, more so than they did deep political commitments or understanding. So they resented being corporally punished at school and sitting in dilapidated classrooms. They were frightened by the apartheid soldiers who patrolled their streets. They were struggling to pass their exams and knew they had few employment opportunities waiting for them beyond school. Becoming a comrade, a young activist, offered both young men and women a sense of purpose, a political education that was unavailable to them in school, and even feelings of enjoyment and belonging. Yet both groups still acted as gendered beings, and the inequalities that they experienced as young Black people were also very much gendered. So I wanted to quickly illustrate this with two related stories. So speaking about her decision to join the struggle, one woman explained how only female students were expected to clean classrooms at school. If the rooms were left dirty, only female students would be beaten. She said, and I quote, "We don't clean the class with our breasts. Because everybody is making the class dirty, we should all clean. The teacher was not beating the boys. The only difference between boys and girls is the breasts. Otherwise, we all have hands, we all have feet. Why can't they clean?" Another woman talked about the gendered and sexualized embarrassment that such corporal punishment could cause. She said, quote, "Some of us women, we were beaten on our behinds. Can you imagine when you had a skirt on and the sjambok or the whip is like floop, the skirt flies up, and it wasn't nice for girls." So I think these two quotes speak to just some of the gender differences in the lives of Soweto's young men and young women. Girls during these years were very much subjected to what Pumla Gokola calls the female fear factory. In the 1980s, various rates of sexual violence, rape rates, and particularly brutal forms of gang rape were on the rise in Soweto. And these girls negotiated their daily lives in fear of such violence, not just in the streets, but in their own homes and in their classrooms. Their vulnerability, combined with social expectations of what it meant to be a good girl or young woman, limited their freedom of movement. Much more so than boys, they tended to be restricted to the home, where they also bore the burden of domestic duties. So for young women then, joining the struggle was not just about rebelling against apartheid, but also about rebelling against gender norms. It was not only about fighting the injustices they faced as students, but also the particular vulnerabilities they faced as young women. Becoming a comrade offered a radical departure from the feelings of subservience or victimhood often instilled in them as young women. And to understand this, we need to explore how the gendered inequalities they experienced intersected and were really kind of interwoven with those they also experienced on account of their age, race, and class. The second point I want to make is about how listening to women's narratives forces us to expand our ideas of activism beyond street politics and organized struggle, and to dismantle any neat separation between the private and the public. So much of the early historiography on South Africa's liberation struggle created a false binary between private and public spaces. While popular images of male comrades often depict them as visibly engaged in the public sphere, protesting, toy-toying, confronting the police, depictions of women and girls often portrayed them as defenders of home and hearth, confined to the private sphere. And this binary obscures our understanding of the struggle in multiple ways. It has blinded us to girls' involvement in public spaces, and particularly to their more militant and confrontational involvement in the struggle. But it has also isolated and separated girls' politicization from the gendered and generational power dynamics of the home. So what became apparent from the narratives of my female interviewees was how South Africa's young comrades were not just activists, but they were simultaneously people's children, community members, friends, and sometimes even parents themselves. And there was no neat boundary between a young person's political and non-political or public and private life. For female comrades in particular, their family relationships and the gender dynamics of the home shaped their activism in ways that were restricting and potentially empowering. So these points were particularly well illustrated by my interview with one woman named Zanele. Zanele lived with her grandparents, who expected her to cook and clean most evenings after school. But as she became increasingly involved in politics, she struggled to keep up with these duties. So I quote from Zanele: "It was a little bit difficult because you want to go to attend the meetings, but you know that at home you must prepare the fire and put the pot on for supper. And then maybe when you were there preparing the fire, you hear next door, they're yelling, the police are coming. Then you have to leave all those things. The pots are going to be ruined. Maybe it was easy for men, but for us, it was difficult because I got beaten every day by my grandmother. If I didn't finish to do the cooking, cleaning, I was beaten maybe in a week, thrice." Zanele's troubles with her grandmother didn't end there. Eventually, she forbade Zanele from staying at home, fearing that she would draw the attention of the police. Zanele expressed pride in rebelling against these gendered norms and parental pressures, yet she also spoke openly about the personal challenges of this. And she said, quote, "It was so painful because I missed them. I want to see them, you know? I want to change my clothes, but I wasn't allowed. It wasn't safe for me to go home." Now, young women's complex negotiation of parental disappointment and their contradictory efforts to both defy parental authority and maintain family harmony help to explain why their involvement in the struggle was often shorter in duration and less visible than male comrades. Girls were often sent by their parents to live away from Soweto with other relatives in an attempt to stop their activism. Others desperately wanted to go into exile or to join MK, but were begged not to by their mothers. Male comrades, at least from my interviews, didn't seem to struggle in quite the same ways. They often narrated parental conflict nonchalantly and didn't seem to have the same difficulties in managing these overlapping and conflicting identities. And one of my male interviewees expressed this really succinctly. He said, quote, "We always knew that female comrades had to be supported because they had this extra burden that they were carrying, the expectation about them from society and their parents. Not that we also did not have parental pressure at the time, but for them, it was much more coordinated and more complex." Now, on the other hand, the gender dynamics of the home could play a more positive role in young women's activism and enable them to take on certain forms of political labor. Many young women were tasked with hiding documents or weapons in their parents' houses, or holding meetings at home, disguised as dance troupe practices. They also applied the lessons they'd learned from their own navigations of family difficulties to other families, and took on social work type roles in their communities, intervening in other households where kids weren't attending school or had been abandoned by their parents. So these women's narratives, I think, really demonstrate the interconnected nature of the public and private in histories of the struggle. We can see how for female comrades, heroic action wasn't only about openly confronting the apartheid state in the streets, but also included rebelling against or even simply negotiating gender dynamics within the home and balancing the demands of being a good activist and a good daughter. Okay, so now to my final point for this talk. I think that women's accounts, more so than men's, tended to highlight the inconsistencies and unresolved tensions of youth politics. The women I spoke to spoke remarkably candidly about how it felt to be a comrade, and these feelings were often deeply contradictory. They spoke about the rush and intoxicating feeling of throwing a petrol bomb, the pride and satisfaction, but also guilt and remorse they felt when punishing members of their own community for defying strategic boycotts or informing on them to the police. They described their male comrades as respectful and insisted that they were treated as equals in the student movement, yet they also discussed multiple moments where they were disrespected, subordinated, or even violated by the male activists. When I asked women to reflect on their time as comrades, their responses were not always what I expected. So for example, take the narrative of Beatrice. After joining the Congress of South African Students in 1985, Beatrice became a particularly active comrade in her home township of Pimville. She worked as a women's organizer for the student and youth movements and continued her political involvement working with the ANC after 1994. She was very eager to share her story with me, a foreign researcher, and very much portrayed herself as an important historical actor. Talking about male comrades in Soweto, she told me, quote, "I think most of the guys, they will say it was Beatrice. When they talk about Pimville, they will talk about me." And this was not some overstatement of her personal importance. When I spoke to male comrades from Pimville, they did all mention Beatrice as this key political force in the community. So at the end of our interview, I asked Beatrice if today she feels empowered by everything she experienced as a teenager. And I really expected her answer to be an explicit yes, given the way she kind of presented herself as a historical actor. But her response was much more complicated. She said that she was still struggling now to have her own house and her own car, and to overcome her lack of education, which was disrupted by the struggle. She was disappointed by the greed she saw in post-apartheid politicians. And by the way, she was stigmatized by some men in her community for her past political activities. So these contradictions and ambiguities in many women's narratives make it difficult to clearly categorize them as empowered or disempowered or proud or apologetic. But in blurring these boundaries, these women's stories challenge dominant histories of South Africa's liberation struggle, and I think reveal the messy complexities of political participation and its aftermath. The historical picture they paint is not a rosy, unequivocal celebration of a war won, but an introspective tale of what it meant and how it felt to be a young woman against apartheid, both at the time of the struggle and in the 3 decades since. These women, the roles they played have certainly not been consigned to the past, but continue to shape their everyday lives. And my book tries to explore these pasts while also highlighting their continued relevance in the present, as these women today insist they are still struggling to achieve the dreams they had for South Africa as teenagers. So just to quickly conclude, there are other key arguments and chapters in the book that I haven't mentioned today. There's a chapter specifically on the complicated and very contradictory relationships between young male and female activists. There's a chapter on female comrades' involvement in political violence, and another on their experiences of being detained and imprisoned. And there are also many subjects definitely not covered by the book, and a lot of further work remains to be done in this field. On other decades, locations, and groups of women on rural areas, girls from colored or Indian communities, the LGBTQ community, and very much on the lives of non-politicized girls during apartheid, where I think research remains particularly thin. As I said, the book is not a political history, and some readers may definitely find gaps in the book, particularly when it comes to political ideology and organizational structure. But the book reflects the views of the 1980s township uprisings as they were recollected by the girls and young women who participated in them. And I hope that in sharing their stories, these women have not only added their contribution to existing histories of the struggle, but have also challenged and renegotiated these histories, pushing us to think about gender, generation, and youth politics in new ways. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Emily. I'll hand over to Rachel.
Great. So, hi, everyone. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to Shireen Hassan for the invitation to speak. And thank you to Emily Bridger for writing this book that's bringing us together today. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm delighted to have the chance to discuss it. So in my remarks, I want to take a sort of overarching focus on the unique and spatial organization of this book and what that enables. Rather than a chronological or narrative structure, the book's chapters are organized spatially into chapters on the school, the home, the meeting, the prison cell, and the interview. I think the structure really enables a few critical and engaging new contributions. And maybe here I'll pose a first question to Emily, which is that I'd love to later on hear more about how you arrived at this structure and how you chose this particular mode of organization. But let me talk now about what I see it as enabling. First, I think this structure really lets us resist the logic of the organizational archive, and you touch on this a bit in your talk as well. Historian Suraj Rasool has made this point, made this critique most clearly, arguing that the documentary tradition in South African politics has led to a real overemphasis on formal organizational politics, the tendency to treat South African politics as a chronological trajectory moving through a series of self-identified resistance organizations. Here, Bridger's choice to yield to the non-linear and non-organizational focus of her interviews, I think, enables new insights, breaking us out of the confines of COSAS as an organization or as a structure. In drawing attention to how women lived as activists across the disparate spaces of the home, the street, school, the meeting room, Bridger expands the scope of what counts as a political history and of who counts. This method lets us see into the very human and even banal sides of political involvement. Bridger notes, for example, that women recall being called dirty because they couldn't sleep at home and therefore couldn't bathe. This intimate recollection of mockery and even shame, its very physicality, its unglamorousness, I found poignant and memorable disruption of the standard histories of politics. Equally, the inclusion of the chapter on the prison cell was also striking. It seems to me that few histories of political engagement in South Africa have spoken seriously about time in prison. As Bridger points out, many people have written prison memoirs. Very few political histories address this period, meaning imprisonment is often relegated to the personal realm outside of the space of politics. This book's approach, which throughout works, as Bridger said in her introduction here, works to break down the false divides between the public and private sphere, challenges this exclusion and insists that time in jail was as much a part of the experience of political activism as attending meetings or protests. This chapter also contains the most direct quotes from the interviews, which are very powerful. And I found myself wondering if the choice to include more direct quotes in the chapter was in part a motivation to hold space for the pain that the recollections brought up for the interviewees. Bridger's spatial methodology also allowed her to include a chapter on the interview itself. Again, I think this is bold and unique. Rather than relegating the generation of the oral histories to a brief method section in the introduction, giving these experiences a chapter in their own right acknowledges the interviews as a site of knowledge production, not just the collection of pre-existing data. This acknowledgement, itself political, lets Bridger speak with sensitivity about her own presence as a young white North American woman attached to a global university, and how that affected what played out in interviews and what story can be told. My students these days love to talk about positionality and the positionality of authors. And of course, that's brave and correct of them, but I find they often stop there with a sort of demographic list of the author's overt identity markers. By contrast, I think Bridger's book models an effort to think about positionality in a more engaged way, not just listing demographic characteristics and stopping there, but considering, in fact, what her position enabled and disabled in her conversations. I would say that the same critical openness or awareness of the dynamics of the interview lets Bridger attend to inconsistencies with sensitivity. For example, she notes that women explicitly identified comrades' meetings as spaces where they were completely equal to their male comrades and where there was no gender discrimination. Gender didn't exist, they would tell her. But then, as they went on to describe various instances of marginalization or exclusion on the basis of gender, Bridger offers thoughtful explanations for this contradiction. For example, she points out that COSAS meetings, in fact, were spaces that accorded women a comparable degree of freedom in the comparison with the rest of their lives, a useful historical reminder. But she also acknowledges the pressure that women experienced to recall such spaces in an idealized way. I appreciate the openness of the reflection here. Bridger foregrounds the words of the women, but also ventures her own interpretation respectfully. I also found myself wondering if it could be interesting to explore further here why gender equality was theoretically celebrated, even if it was in practice imperfectly realized. Following up on this question of gender, in her chapter on the streets, Bridger explores the troubling fact that her interviewees were willing to speak openly and even with excitement about acts of violence, something male comrades were less likely to mention. Bridger argues that precisely because women were more marginalized and seen as excluded from the domain of confrontational politics, they had more reason to emphasize rather than downplay their involvement in such events. A key debate in the literature has been over whether women participated in more confrontational politics merely as honorary men or surrogate men. While this is an important element, I think Bridger's work really offers a new analytical concept here, a new analytical insight here via the concept of struggle femininity. With this concept, Bridger suggests that women's violence itself must be understood as gendered, motivated not only by adherence to organizational politics, the demands of COSAS, but also by the desire to confront restrictive gender norms and to become part of and defend a particular community. These factors, Bridger observes, continue to shape women's capacity to later narrate their experiences, including perhaps silencing feelings of guilt or grief at the expense of more celebratory accounts. Many existing studies on violence have emphasized, intentionally or not, male participation and excluded consideration of women. Of course, Shireen Hassam's recent work on Winnie Madikizela Mandela is a powerful exception, drawing attention to Madikizela Mandela's deployment of an alternative populist mode, which included accepting violence as a means of politics. And I think Bridger's book reads really well alongside these insights. This book strongly suggests the need for more research into non-elite and non-leadership women's participation in violent acts, their motivations, and the impact of violence on their own lives. Beyond violence alone, though, Bridger assesses the meaning of politics more broadly for these women. Again, in the chapter on the space of the interview, Bridger provides rich insights into the ongoing connections and networks of solidarity between these women, really conveying a strong feeling of everyday life today. These women, alongside some of their male comrades, are still friends, enjoy each other's company, and support each other. Without romanticizing their condition, and indeed, Bridger describes their feeling that the struggle is not over and a certain disappointment with many features of their lives, she's able to show the ongoing present of past political structure. This approach successfully avoids both nostalgia and disillusionment in favor of a more complex middle ground. Indeed, a particular strength of this work is its attention to the many meanings of political commitment for these women. Bridger writes that their stories challenge the temporal divides in histories of the liberation struggle, precisely because so many of these women see themselves as still struggling, not feeling resolved or satisfied by the events of 1994 and formal political settlement. It's only in the last chapters that Bridger talks more about these women as ANC and the tensions between COSAS as an ANC formation and the alternative Black consciousness formations in the period. I wondered if there was more to say about those fault lines. And in general, I found myself curious to hear a little more about these women's politics. The book shows us very clearly that while these women firmly and confidently identified as ANC, their actions and practice involved a whole network of meanings. And the discussion of the punishment of rapists is, for example, really interesting here. But I found myself eager to hear more about the implicit theorizations of politics and the political by these women, even if they didn't necessarily use those terms. In closing, let me say I think this is a book that really delivers on the potentials and promises of feminist oral historical work, namely oral history's capacity to disrupt our expectations, to surprise us, and to force us to listen to analysis from historical subjects outside the academy who offer their own insights into how and why history matters. So thank you very much.
Great comments, Rachel. Thank you. Emily, do you want to, you were asked just one question really about the spatial organization of the book or your choice of those themes, which I have to add that I found that incredibly interesting as well. And I was particularly taken by the meeting, the chapter on the meeting, which strikes me as really rich with material for theorizing what happens when in the public space of politics. So, who speaks, when they speak, with what effect. And I'll just add on to that spatiality question that in the Fees Must Fall movement, as you know, the meeting was the central moment of disruption between women and men. It was about who commanded the stage, right? And that there was on the one hand, the idea of horizontality and everyone being equal in the meeting, but on the other hand, there was a definite attempt by the young men to argue that women were not effective at mobilizing the crowd. They were not effective in the rhetoric of a mass meeting and in kind of pulling the crowd together, particularly at crucial moments when divisions began to appear within the crowd. So I found your spatial discussions really interesting. And if I could just add onto that one more question, that methodological question I'd like you to respond to, and that is, you do talk a little bit about the limits of recollection as the way to understand the experiences of young women in the 70s and the early 80s. So you're interviewing them after a certain time has passed, and more importantly, after when there's much more openness about the feminist agenda, right? And there's more language within which to speak about gender. And so you hint at times about the ways in which, some of it may have reflected their retrospective positioning of what they were doing, that they read backwards into their actions, feminist motivations or feminist rationale for their actions. I think that was really an interesting part of the book, and we're all trying to deal with that. I think those of us working with memory, the unreliability of memory in part, but also some of the aggrandizing that happens inevitably when people look back on their heyday, right, and wish to present it as a period in which they, of course, were on the right side, had the best ideology. It's quite normal. Rachel pointed out that there are now lots of memoirs emerging as part of our resources that we can now use. They were not there. You couldn't speak openly in the 80s about what you really thought. Many discourses, and particularly feminism as discourse, was repressed by men in the movements, but also by the state. So I'm interested methodologically in how you navigated those. I know for those people who haven't read the book, Emily does hint at this in the book, so I'm really wanting to draw it out a bit.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Rachel, for those really lovely and thoughtful comments. I think, Shireen. On the spatial organization of the book, that actually came down to a suggestion made by one of my PhD examiners, Rebecca Lee, which I'm incredibly grateful for, because the chapter organization of the PhD itself was an absolute mess. There was some spatial chapters and then just some other completely random chapters in it. That is what really helped me reconceptualize it and turn it into the book. Shireen, your questions about methodology. I mean, that is my favorite part of oral history. I love trying to untangle all the layers of the past and the present. And, I think these women have so many different motivations for telling their stories. And for the most part, the people I interviewed really wanted to speak to me. There were kind of 2 or 3 people I contacted who weren't interested in participating, but most of the ones who did, you know, were really eager and really excited. And I just love pulling those different motivations apart. And I think my methodological approach is always, you know, I can't say for sure what's happening in an oral history interview, what's aggrandizing, what's not, what's a kind of presentist lens and an ad hoc recollection and what's not. But what I try and do in my writing is reflect that uncertainty. So say, you know, it might be this, it might be that, but acknowledge like the lack of, you know, as historians, we can't know. All we can do is interpret. And I think the best thing is to actually provide multiple interpretations, and then let that sit with the reader. Yeah.
I mean, just to you know, draw that a little bit into your chapter on your work on violence, which, gosh, I mean, it's fabulous material you have in this book, and certainly some things that I haven't heard people speak about quite as much. So the celebration of some maybe 1, maybe 2 of the women, their celebration of their role in necklacing, right? Which kind of, as you're reading the book, it really hits you as, I certainly haven't seen anyone, any woman do that. In fact, you know, my own work on the 80s, I mean, I show how much of that necklacing was directed at women, how women were the victims of it, and how that led to a certain fissure in Soweto and Uitenhage and so on, between the women and the men over political strategies. So that on the question of violence there too, I wondered how much that was inflected by the moment from 2015 on. I think that's when you were doing your interviews, right? When violence was re-entering politics and was again romanticized and valorized, because I mean that seemed to be a moment in which violence was reframed. But of course, women were involved in violence in the 1980s. Of course, that and that it has been a little bit of a suppressed history. But what did you make of it? When you were interviewing women, how did that conversation pan out? Because it really was striking how pleased the one woman in particular was. I mean, almost was a celebration of physical violence.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, it was definitely challenging to navigate in these interviews. And it's so interesting that the one woman you mentioned who really does talk about necklacing informers, she was the same interviewee who talked quite a lot about remorse for other forms of political violence, particularly for attacking buses during this bus boycott. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to see such strong remorse in some cases and then such strong celebration in others. And I think, again, that really speaks to these kind of unresolved feelings these women have about their roles. Coming back to your previous question about aggrandizing as well, I mean, what I found it really interesting is how differently the men and women I spoke to talked about violence and how men kept it this open secret. So my male interviewees seemed to love dropping into conversation that they knew things that they weren't going to tell me about. You know, they talk about military training and having guns and, you know, more sophisticated weapons. And then they'd say, oh, but I can't tell you about that. So they dropped enough information in to tell me, you know, I was very seriously involved in this and I was obviously a key player, but they kept that kind of culture of secrecy from the 1980s. And I think that culture of secrecy itself was also a way to say, I was in the middle of this, I was in the thick of things, I know better than to talk about this. Whereas the women, I think, in part because they really wanted to challenge this narrative that they weren't there, so they kind of like threw themselves in their stories. and even being involved in these aspects, which they really haven't been acknowledged as being involved in. But then also I think, you know, they're slightly further removed from these centers of political power. So maybe didn't have that same kind of enforcement of the culture of secrecy. And that was really quite apparent. In terms of if their narratives were affected by violence re-entering politics. So most of the interviews were 2014, actually quite close to the national elections, which were held that year, if I'm remembering right. I think there were elections in April 2014 or May. I did a lot of interviews in kind of the 2 months running up to those elections, which I think really shaped how people talked about the ANC. And that comes back to Rachel's question actually about kind of this really strong alignment to the ANC, but not really kind of picking apart what that meant. I think a lot of that had to do with the election. Most of the interviews were concluded before or very shortly after Rhodes Must Fall really got going in Cape Town. And certainly by the time Fees Must Fall was going, I was just doing the odd follow-up interview. And most of the interviews were in 2014. So they were a bit before that. One other thing to mention is Rachel brought up, Shireen, your work on Winnie. And a lot of these women talked about Winnie Madikizela Mandela. And that was actually how I kind of got involved in this research. I'd been in Soweto doing some previous research on Winnie, and that was where I first met former female comrades. And whereas they very much saw her as this kind of hero and an icon, the male comrades I spoke to were much more critical in certain ways. So I think that kind of ties into that whole conversation about violence. And certainly a lot of these conversations and these kind of reassessments of Winnie's legacy were going on at that time.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's another long discussion to be had about generations and the intergenerational conversation here. But why don't I open it up for some other questions, and then we can come back. Sarah Duff, I see your hand. Go ahead. Unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you can. Sarah?
Then yeah. Hello. Thank you. It feels a shame to interrupt this conversation. I was just so enjoying listening to all three of you. And Emily, congratulations. As you know, I've heard you present from this book at a number of conferences, so it's really fantastic to see it all pulled together in a book. And I just wanted to add to a sort of a group largely of Africanists that Emily's work is really important in the field of the history of childhood and youth too, and I think addresses some of the sort of unspoken assumptions about youth activism that are very present in the field in a way that is complicated and interesting. So well done, Emily. I actually have a question that slightly picks up from what Shireen was saying at the end about intergenerational tensions. My question sort of goes off in a slightly different direction, and I'm sorry, this is a really boring historian of childhood question, but my question was, who are the girls? How are you defining these age categories? Because I noticed your title is Young Women Against Apartheid, and so I was interested, who qualifies as young women, because so much of the scholarship on youth that you were alluding to at the beginning of your presentation not only genders all youth as Black and male, but it also often allows quite older men to enjoy quite a long youth, whereas women are never afforded that sort of luxury of remaining young for a very long time, that women tend to become older much more quickly, are regarded as adults. So I'm wondering, how are these young women constituted as girls, as young women? I heard you say the word teenager. How are they perceived? And because all of those age categories bring different kinds of expectations about behavior and so on with them. I've got many, many questions, and that's a huge one. So I'm just going to ask that one and then ask one very small question, which is about money. And I was just thinking about your point about the fact that so many boys found it easier just to leave, young men, to go off into exile. And I was wondering about the fact that they might have had jobs, and these are young women who probably didn't have access to that kinds of cash. So my question was actually like, what kind of money do they have access to? I'm assuming pocket money isn't the issue here. There's something else going on, and I've actually started thinking about this question when I was thinking about the consumer boycotts of the 1980s and the way that girls might have been aware of those in ways that boys might not have been. But I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah. So Emily, the South African, the ANC Youth League uses 35, I think, as the cutoff for youth. Has always been somewhat risible, but hey, until I was 35, I quite liked being thought of too. Yeah. So I also had a question about that. I think that's a good question. I wanted to ask you, how did you define young women? Because they do span schoolgirls through to young women in university even.
That is a great question. Thank you so much, Sarah. I purposefully avoid making a strict definition in the book. But I think, so part of what motivated the study and what motivated me to study youth and children in general was I became very frustrated as a grad student by theorizations of childhood and youth in Africa that were so male-centric, and where the transition to adulthood is marked by certain things or markers in a man's life. And I just kind of found there was this assumption that girls have children or they get married and then they're no longer children or they're no longer youth. But of course, in places like South Africa, that's obviously not 17. But those kids were primarily looked after by their own mothers or grandmothers, and they were off participating in the struggle or were in school. So that certainly didn't make them not eligible as to be counted as children or youths. Of course, marriage rates were low then, are lower now. So marriage is certainly no marker of adulthood for a woman. I don't think it ever should be. Some of these women, this kind of ties into your question about money. Some did have jobs, but that didn't necessarily qualify them as adults either. So, I mean, in my book, it was somewhat easy because all the people I'd interviewed were teenagers, to use that term, at least when they got involved in the struggle. So I didn't have to put this kind of upper boundary on what is youth. But it's interesting when they, as Rachel mentioned, the book kind of talks about the like temporal boundaries of the struggle. And the women I spoke to, they didn't talk about 1990 or 1994. Like their narratives just kind of all of a sudden blended into, after Mandela was released or into the post-apartheid period. And I would try and go back and say, okay, well, did something change in 94? Did you stop? Did you keep going? And it was this kind of phasing into adulthood and phasing out of the struggle sometimes. And often that was to do with child care responsibilities and financial responsibilities, and women just finding that they didn't have the time. And there's one anecdote I really quite like in the last chapter about a woman, and she kind of realized she had kids as a teenager and she hadn't really been there in their childhoods, and she decided to leave politics and go and be a mother instead. But then a few years later she then went back to politics. So like all this literature talks about, it's not a neat moment when you stop being a child or a youth and you become an adult. But I think more broadly, we really need to rethink that in a way that decenters male experience. And I think there's much bigger questions to be asked about definitions of childhood and youth that accommodate girls and women as well as men. And in terms of terminology, I've had discussions about calling these women girls. And someone made a very good point to me once that when you talk about the male comrades, male activists in the struggle, they're not called boys. Typically, they'll be called men, or at least young men, but we're talking about people of the same age. So that made me reluctant to call them girls when I was speaking about them as kind of political actors. I think it could have been interpreted as infantilizing, especially if you're not going to use boys for men of the same age. And so I fell into this kind of default position of girls and young women, or young women, or female youth. But like I said, I managed to avoid any kind of strict chronological definitions.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think it is a tricky terrain in a number of ways. Hard to figure out what language to use. While I'm waiting for other people to raise their hands for questions, you're absolutely right that a lot of this literature on youth is about the men, and a lot of it is more than about men. It's about the making of masculinity through politics. And I'd be interested, Emily, you talk about struggle femininity, but it's not, you know, it's about it's not conventional femininity either. There's a sort of different kind of heroism and a breaking of the normatively accepted versions of femininity. And I'll be interested to hear some comments on that, but also from Rachel, because some of your work touches on this as well, right? As women go into exile. I mean, Emily's work is about the women who stayed, the girls who stayed behind and didn't leave. Yours is about the same parts of your work, about the same generation that did leave, and you know, achieved some degree of status within the exiled movement by virtue of being in MK. So by taking up arms, by using that as a pathway. So I'll just leave that question there for the moment, Emily, as something to think about. Monica and Katie have their hands up. So Monica.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this talk and all of the wonderful comments. Emily, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. I wanted to ask about, I wanted to ask an oral history kind of question about the way that you chose to identify the people that you interviewed, and in particular, what their wishes were on this. So I was struck by when you were talking about, I believe, Beatrice. She seems to be someone who was locally known, perhaps more broadly. So my question is, in my own work, I found a real mix of some people who want to be named, you know, properly and fully, and they want full attribution for the words that they say. And then others have wanted anonymity and real protection from ever being connected to what they share. And then I've had people sort of in between. And of course, we know as people who do oral histories and who do work in memory studies that these positions aren't stable either. So I've had to deal with people who have changed their mind about that, and you can never fully predict the consequences of your work. We learned that from the TRC process, which was another site of lots of public presentations of past histories with varying you know, identification. So could you talk a little about those issues? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monica. Oh, sorry, Shireen.
Do you want to take Katie's question as well, or do you want to answer that first?
I'll jump in and answer Monica's
Yeah.
while the juices are flowing. Thanks, Monica. Great question. I'm actually hosting a lunchtime chat tomorrow on exactly this question. You know, do we name subjects in contemporary historical research? And when I was making the decisions about this, I mean, initially for the thesis, I was obviously a very junior scholar, and I felt really overwhelmed by the decision. It was something I talked through with quite a few people. I've recently become chair of my university's ethics committee, and it's made me rethink some of these decisions I made earlier in my career. But the vast majority of people I spoke to wanted to be identified and fully identified. They wanted their stories known and attributed to them, which was all well and good, but then lots of them talked about participating in violence. Now, they did self-censor those stories in a lot of ways. No one ever said, you know, this person, this named person was the target of this violence in this place on this date. You know, I don't think you could ever actually link any specific incident of violence talked about by an interviewee to a specific person without doing a lot of kind of corroborating research. So for that reason, I was really uncomfortable making them fully identifiable, but then that was their wish, and I wasn't comfortable saying, I know better than you, and I'm going to I can never say this word, pseudonymize you. So I went for a weird in between, which is where I've used their first names, the ones that wanted their names used. There's a couple people whose names I've changed, and there's a couple people who wanted to be known by kind of nicknames they had during the struggle. But most it is their real first name. Lots of people chose to use their kind of Christian English name rather than by a name in an African language they might go by locally. But that was kind of the compromise I arrived at. There were other identifying details I removed because of that. You know, I haven't put in dates of birth and things like that. And occasionally I'd find traces in the archives related to people I'd interviewed, not very often, just kind of, I think 2 cases, 3 cases maybe. And there I also kind of de-linked them or removed identifying details so that those connections couldn't necessarily be made by people later looking at those archival files, because then you'd have kind of full personal information.
Thanks, Katie.
Hi, I have a question that goes back to the discussion that you were having with Shireen and Rachel earlier about defining youth as a category and these women's sort of definitions as youth. And my question is about whether you can maybe tell us a little bit more about the roles of authority and leadership that young women took on when they were part of, when they became comrades. You mentioned sort of women taking on sort of social worker roles, intervening in family disputes. And I wonder whether you would say that sort of did young women sort of become adults because of these roles of authority that they took on? Yeah, was that something that your interviewees felt was true for them?
Really interesting question. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so these various roles of authority or leadership, I mean, some are kind of organizational and structural. Some women became, you know, secretary of this organization within this branch, treasurer, you know, these sorts of roles you have in any organization. And then these more kind of social leadership roles. Yeah, so they intervened in families. They particularly intervened in cases where girls weren't attending school, and particularly where girls were kind of seen to be engaging in deviant behavior instead, so were smoking or drinking when they were meant to be in school. And they certainly did take on positions of authority like well above their age. You know, there'd be stories where a mother had abandoned her children and they'd go to that mother and convince her to come home. And, you know, when they were, I'm not sure if you're a South Africanist, Katie. So there was a consumer boycott, so people weren't allowed to buy at white-owned shops. And if you were caught with groceries, these would be destroyed and you might be beaten. So, you know, they were physically intervening in much older women's lives. The women they were kind of confronting during this consumer boycott would have been a generation or 2 generations older than them. They never spoke about that as adulthood or becoming adulthood. I think that's a really interesting lens through which to view this. They did talk about being more, they didn't use the word mature, but I'd call it mature as a result of engaging in the struggle. So when I asked them to reflect back and, you know, did you think it made you, you know, how did it affect who you are now? They would say things like, oh, well, I learned discipline. They often talked about learning to have fewer children than their other female kind of counterparts who weren't in the struggle, which I found really interesting. And you know, like I said, a lot of them did have children while they were comrades, but they talked about, you know, they aren't addicted to alcohol or addicted to drugs like other people in their communities. They talked a lot about the discipline they learned. But that was all part of being a comrade. And, you know, being a comrade was to be disciplined. And I think being a comrade meant to be a youth. So I don't know if they saw that as becoming adults, but it certainly impacted who they are as adults, if that makes sense.
Definitely Uma, I'll come to you in a minute. Just definitely there is a sense reading your book that there is a kind of an excitement about politics, right? Now you do. I love the way in which you draw that out. The kind of the thrill of being involved in politics, which it kind of reminds me a little bit of the work of Monique Marks on young warriors, because there you see, and in fact, Clive Glazer and so on, where it's gangs or politics, like that, the struggle or gangs, that's the direction you can go in, right? And the women who are, these young women, these girls who get involved, also exhibit some of those qualities of excitement and the thrill of being part of something large and being rebellious and all of these, which is different a little bit from, Katie, from what you're talking about in the social worker kind of roles, which the older women in the movements were definitely doing and were taking on, especially in exile, right? So I found that was an interesting, you made me think about that question also in some of my own work, that it was, in my research, it was often the young women who were opposing the social worker roles and wanting actually to be able to be fully present in politics without the burdens, and were complaining about male comrades who expected them to wash their clothes and prepare the food and so on. Just adding to that complexity. I think we'll know more and more about it as time goes by and more people start to feel they can write about it. Mo Sheikh's memoir, by the way, gives you a wonderful insight into a small group of young women who were able to exploit their immunity, almost their gendered immunity, their sort of invisibility, to do a whole lot of really important work underground. So, as we go along, more of those stories will emerge, I'm sure, and we will all deepen our understanding of this. So now there's a list of people: Uma, and then Vinny, and then Rachel.
Hi, I'm coming at a bit of a disadvantage because, I haven't read the book, and, I also missed the first 15 minutes, so I don't really know what was said there. But I've been teaching a course on oral histories with Connie Benson and Paulo Israel. And I had a section that I taught specifically, which was on oral histories of violence. And, there was one extremely good reading, and, you forget all these gray hairs means that the name has left me at the moment, but it was a fantastic thesis on the Kasinga massacre. And it was a PhD student from our department, and I really want to kick myself for missing his name now, but he had some excellent, analysis of language, of how people speak about language. And, has the language got the capacity to actually voice this? And he looked at some strategies where people used metaphors, for instance. This was like, so it's actually not saying exactly what it was, but it was similar to this, like being a Mopani worm being run over or something like that. So I was wondering whether you found any, if you could speak about the language in which people speak. Shireen mentioned the necklacing, for instance. What language are they using to speak like this? And then the second one was, I used Urashi Bhattacharya's text on partition in India. Really violent, descriptions of what goes on. And in order to make a comparison of, and the way in which there are gendered narratives, you do need a male narrative in order to find out how different the female narratives are. And so I was wondering whether you had looked into that, because she's found significant, I mean, there was like really amazing differences between the way in which a father and a son and then the mother speak about the very same incidents. So it was actually wonderful to have 3 narratives about the same incident and then study it in detail for the way in which they all 3 tell the story. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Uma. First, on the question of language, a huge downside to this piece of research was, so in the UK, we don't get language funding for our PhDs. It's not something that's prioritized. You know, I took Zulu a night or 2 a week, but that's not enough to do interviews. So these interviews were mostly conducted in English. For a few, one of the women herself came with me as kind of a research assistant and offered translation where it was necessary. Now, most of the interviewees, because of kind of their generation and educational background, they're fluent in English, but it might not be their preferred language for verbalizing, especially these more difficult memories. And that's a huge problem with the book and me being the researcher who wrote it. Language was really interesting, and particularly, so there's a chapter on experiences of detention and imprisonment. And like Rachel said, I didn't even realize I'd done this, Rachel, but I guess the quotes I give there, the direct quotes, are longer. Because language was really important in there, and not just language, but pace. And I found when they were talking about more traumatic memories, language became stuck. You know, you'd get the same word kind of repeated over and over again. And that's something really common to people speaking about trauma and, you know, this inability of language. Looking into male narratives. So yeah, so I said at the beginning, so there were about 50 kind of core interviewees for the book, 30 female, 20 male. Men's narratives are really interesting. Some, you know, completely kind of applauded their female comrades and just talked about how brave and integral to the struggle they were. Others denied their existence. And these are people who, you know, they're friends, they were in the same organizations, they were in the same meetings. So I got very different narratives of the same kind of political moments and spaces. And a lot of them were really contradictory. And one thing that was really interesting, I was set up to interview one man, and I was speaking to kind of one of the gatekeepers who helped me find interviewees, another male comrade, and he said, so you're interviewing this guy, and he said, he's gonna pretend like he's a feminist, he's gonna talk all this talk about gender equality, but trust me, you know, he's not. And if it's just me and him, he'll say incredibly misogynistic things. And it was true, he did, like he didn't, his feminist mask certainly didn't hold up. There were all sorts of kind of things leaking through it. But yeah, there were differences between men and other men's narratives. There were differences within men's narratives. And yeah, I'm really happy that I did interview those men as well. I didn't talk about the men so much in the book. There's a lot of material I have from those male interviewees that I really should do something with.
Well, I think that's actually with the Uma's suggestion of taking different perspectives on the same event would be quite an interesting article to pursue. You probably have the material sitting there, which would be interesting. Vinny.
Hi. So Emily, I wanted to thank you so much, I think, for this presentation. And full caveat, I haven't read the book yet, but I absolutely will now. And I wanted to ask you a question that may take us in a slightly different direction. And it's a question about the relationship between health, broadly put, and liberation among the kind of female-bodied activists and people you were interviewing in Soweto in the 1980s. And part of this question is actually driven by my own research, which is trying to tether together the broad relationship of health to ideas of liberation in alternative media, and specifically within magazines like Speak, Staff Writer, Teach and Learn. But often what I come across is the articulation of the absence of health as a particular kind of violence, a form of slow violence. and specifically a lot of literature about cervical cancer and the refusal of the state or the employer or the ANC to take seriously women's bodies and health. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, whether or not you came across any kind of health-related subject in your interviews, and, you know, what that may or may not mean, what the absence of health may mean in relation to your own work.
Thanks so much. Gosh, that's a really fascinating question and one that I've never thought about before. I'm trying to think. There is stuff on health in the interviews, but it's more kind of about the aftermaths of being a comrade. So, you know, some of these women have a very lasting physical health difficulties because of things that were done to them when they were detained. Some obviously have lasting emotional and mental health issues, as do the men I spoke to. So health only really appeared as a result of struggle, rather than something that they were struggling for or struggling against at the time. I'm trying to think. No, kind of like bodily health just really didn't come up, but it might have been my own biases. It's not something I asked about because it's not something I've really thought of before. So thank you for that. I will do some more thinking on that.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of rolling the conversation back a bit, that definition of discipline that you're talking about and the kind of women's evocation of that sort of definition of discipline as consisting in like birth control, right? Like abstention from sex, and maybe that connects a bit with Vinny's question in interesting ways. And then abstention from alcohol and drugs. To me, that seems so closely linked to the conversations that were going on in exile that it's always complicated to figure out which way the kind of flow of like knowledge and ideas is moving. I actually would think most of the movement of kind of concepts and ideas is usually from inside the country to outside. But in this case, I really do wonder if that's an imported idea from the youth movements in exile at that time, just because it was such a pervasive justification, right, for the ANC in exile, and sort of mode of self-legitimation was to say, we are disciplined comrades, which had a political meaning, but also this really kind of bottling actually of restraint and self-discipline. So anyway, that was just interesting. I guess I wonder.
I mean, you know what I thought of when Vinny was speaking is that actually I'm not surprised Emily didn't find it in the people she interviewed, because it was really coming from the more organized sector. So it was coming from the union movement, right? It was occupational health. Mm-hmm. And it was women within the trade unions who were beginning to raise questions about things like maternity leave, but also access to other kinds of leave, about whether women working in factories who were menstruating had access to sanitation facilities and privacy. And so I think it was coming more from those kinds of spaces. So if you were a young woman involved in the kind of activities Emily's book raises, I think it was not as much of an issue. I'm not saying that it wasn't an issue in their lives, but it wasn't made a political issue yet. It was being politicized and organized around in other kinds of spaces, much more. And then it kind of really takes off later in the late 80s and the early 90s as it gets tied to health policy and so on. But yeah. Belinda and Debbie. Belinda and Debbie Barnon. Oh, Belinda, you were just plugging the journal. Okay, good. Debbie, quite right. I'm happy for you to plug the journal.
Yes, thanks, Shireen. It's just in the chat and you can all read it, and we'd love to get your stuff, that's all.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. I didn't know about your book, so I was very excited to see the announcement on Shireen's page, and I really enjoyed it, and I'll certainly try and locate a copy. I just wanted to come in on Shireen's, well, 2 points, but firstly, Shireen's point about the union movement and picking up issues of women's health. And I think if you look at where the discussion around maternity leave first comes up, it's through Kawusa and through the organizers in Kawusa. So it's not actually necessarily coming from the factory floor itself. And when those first recognition agreements and maternity leave and paternity leave gets granted, many of the women are then complaining that men are just using these to have holidays, not really for the purpose that they were meant for. So that, yeah, I just wanted to bring that in. But secondly, the issue of discipline. I think this is a word that comes up everywhere and in all kinds of contexts. So when I think of the research that I did in KwaZulu-Natal and the political violence there, you get older people talking about the youth being undisciplined and using the fact or using this as a reason to then discipline them, in other words, to intervene, to bring them back home, to stop them from being politically active. And at the same time, you get the youth talking about being disciplined and the need to discipline each other. So this concept has different meanings in different places, but it comes up everywhere. And I certainly think it's something that we need to deconstruct a little bit and think about more the way it's used and its purpose in the discourse of the time. It's more of a comment than a question. Thank you.
So Emily, I'm going to give you the last word because we have a few minutes left and people need to get to the next class, I know, in the Carlton system. So
I'll just respond to Debbie's comment there. Thanks so much for coming, Debbie. I mean, Debbie's work really inspired a lot of what's in the book. So it's great to have you here. Yeah, discipline. I mean, discipline, I think, can often be used as an incredibly euphemistic word in histories of the struggle. You know, it can mean all sorts of things, including quite activities. And it's really interesting what you just said about adults claim that the youth are, you know, not disciplined enough. So maybe, and this comes back to, now I can't remember whose question it was, the brilliant question about adulthood. Oh, Katie's question. Maybe this discourse of discipline was in part a way that youth kind of usurped or claimed adulthood, or at least like the authority that came with adulthood. And it's really interesting that, you know, so many of my interviewees talked about corporal punishment and corporal punishment in school being a reason why they joined the struggle. Yet they themselves use a form of corporal punishment against people that they are it speaks a lot to these kind of cyclical generational histories. You know, we always think that the youth are rebellious and adults see the youth as being different, but you know, it's all just kind of history repeating itself. But also, yeah, discipline as a tool of adulthood and thus authority. Yeah, so thanks for that. Just to close, I did, I'm not sure if it got circulated, but there is a discount code for the book if anyone wants it. It's available in South Africa at a much cheaper price, I believe, in paperback. But if you want to order it in Europe or North America, I do have a 35% discount code for anyone who wants it. So if that didn't get circulated, I mean, just feel free to email me. And I'm happy to send that.
it's in the chat, Emily. So yes, please do get the book. Well, thank you, Emily. Thanks for a rich discussion, Rachel, and thank you, Emily, for being here and for talking about the book. And you know, good luck with your next project. And you know, I hope we'll see you back in the seminar, perhaps talking about new work. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Next week, Femi, it's Mark Gavissa, right, and the Pink Line. On queer histories, a really fascinating book on journeys across the world's queer frontiers with input from Anne Svetkovich here at Carleton and Jordash Elipin at the University of Toronto. So I look forward to seeing you all then. And thank you again, Emily.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you, Rachel, and everyone.